Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Statistics Solutions webinar. My name is Justin D'Souza. I'm a quantitative specialist here at the company. During today's webinar, we are going to look at t-tests primarily, tests of differences, probably the most common used procedure for dissertations. So we'll look at 3 different examples today. We're going to send everyone a copy of the PowerPoint and the webinar following the webinar. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll do a Q&A session at the end. And just let us know if you have any questions. First, I'll give an overview of what we provide at our company in terms of services. Then we'll look at conducting t-tests. We will look at some sample data in SPSS and how to conduct the t-tests and organize your data and how to check for assumptions. And then we'll conclude with a summary and a Q&A session. All right, so on this slide, you can see all the different parts of the dissertation process that we assist with. We have methodologists at our company, both quantitative and qualitative, and then we have literature review specialists. And we also assist with APA, which is not on here, but we do assist with APA formatting. So no matter where you are, if you've hit a roadblock, we can help guide you in the right direction. We can help develop your chapters and provide citations and references to bolster your arguing points. So we help with framing research questions and hypotheses, determining a gap in the literature, pinpointing articles that will support your research. And then with the methodology, both quantitative and qualitative, we can help pinpoint specifically what analyses you need to run based on your research questions and your hypotheses. We can pinpoint your research design, if it's quantitative and correlational or quasi-experimental. And then going into the latter part of the dissertation, IRB, data entry templates. We can host a survey for you on SurveyMonkey. We assist with the development of the results chapter. So if you just send us your data and your research questions, we can crunch the numbers for you and present it in an APA write-up. We also help with the discussion chapter and connecting your findings back to previous literature. And then we assist with the PowerPoints for the proposal and final defense. And we can help condense your dissertation into a journal publication. So if you have any questions about the services, you can give us a call at 727-442-4290. My colleague Sierra is also putting some hyperlinks in the chat box where you can schedule consultations and you can check out our website for free resources. So we're looking at t-tests today, and as I mentioned, this is probably the most common procedure used to look at differences. So when you see t-test, that usually means a comparison between 2 things. That can be 2 groups, that can be 2 measurements over time. So if you're doing an independent sample t-test, that means you're comparing a variable and a value between 2 groups. If you're looking at differences over time, pre-test and a post-test, then you need to do most likely a paired sample t-test. And if you're comparing one variable in your spreadsheet that is numeric to a specified value, then you do a 1 sample t-test. So under this column, you can see the parametric analyses, which are usually the go-to. That's usually what you want to run. But sometimes the data don't meet the assumptions, like normality. Perhaps your data doesn't follow a bell-shaped distribution. Then you might want to shift to a non-parametric technique as an alternative. Okay, so you can see each test does have an alternative that can be run if assumptions are not supported. Okay, and let's go into the normality assumption a little bit more. Most parametric statistics and analyses like t-tests and ANOVAs and regressions, they assume that your data follows a bell-shaped distribution. And there are many ways to check for normality. You can use tests of significance, like a Shapiro-Wilk test or a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, where it gives you a p-value and it tells you, does the data follow a bell-shaped curve, yes or no? But you can also look at skewness and kurtosis values, and you can visually interpret normality with scatter plots and histograms. These are all valid approaches. I prefer to use Shapiro-Wilk tests and Kolmogorov-Smirnov tests because it definitively tells you with stats, do we have a normal distribution or not? Whereas looking at scatter plots and histograms, it's a little more subjective. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, if the data doesn't follow a bell-shaped curve, then you might have to shift your technique so you can use non-parametric statistics instead of parametric techniques. So going back here, again, you might want to initially propose parametric analyses, but if assumptions are not supported, then go with the non-parametric alternative. And if you have a really large sample size, then you can use the central limit theorem to justify proceeding with parametric techniques, even if the assumption of normality is not supported. So the central limit theorem basically states that the larger your sample size is, then the more it tends to approximate towards a normal bell-shaped curve. So 50 I have seen is kind of a benchmark, and I have a citation that supports that here. So 50 is kind of the number to shoot for. All right, so let's look at the t-test first, an independent sample t-test. So this is used when you're looking for differences in a continuous variable between two independent groups. All right, and setting up an independent t-test, you need to have an independent variable that is dichotomous or binary, kind of means the same thing. But you need to have two independent groups. You can't have overlap between your groups, like if you're doing an experimental study, treatment and control, you can't have people in both groups. It needs to exclusively be in one group each. And then you need to have a continuous dependent variable. So that's really anything that's numeric, interval, ratio, scale, that's a continuous variable. And then you will want to check for the assumptions. Independent sample t-test. And I provided a hyperlink here to Statistics Layered, which is a fairly common website I see being used today. So this is where it takes you. And Statistics Layered kind of outlines the purpose of each test, how it needs to be set up, and then what are the statistical assumptions that you need to verify to run that test ideally. And we can see, I think sometimes they go a little overboard with listing too many assumptions, but these two are very important. You know, you need to have a dependent variable that is continuous. You need to have an independent variable that has two groups. You can't have overlap. That's basically what this is saying. Independence of observations. You can't have participants in more than one group. You can check for outliers. This is probably the most important assumption here. So your dependent variable needs to be a normally distributed variable. It needs to follow a bell-shaped curve. Okay, so yeah, great website. There's a different page for almost any analysis, and it explains how to run the tests in SPSS. So let's take a look at some sample data here. Very simple spreadsheet. This is an SPSS. And we have job satisfaction scores calculated before an intervention and after an intervention. So a Likert scale survey was administered. I believe it was 10 questions each, and then a composite score was generated for pre-test and post-test. And then we also have gender in here. So gender, we have gender coded 1 as male and 2 as female. So if we were to run an independent t-test, we could ask something like, is there a significant difference in job satisfaction between males and females? So we have our dependent variables right here, and they're both continuous, they're numeric, and we have gender, which is strictly males and females for this sample. So the first thing I would do is check for the assumption of normality. And to do that, you'll go to Analyze and Descriptive Statistics, and then Explore. Then you're going to move your dependent variables over to this right box, and then we'll click plots. And we will check mark this option right here. Normality plots with. Click continue and OK. And this takes a few seconds to run. Right, and here we go. So what you're looking for is this box right here, tests of normality. And this presents two different tests. We have the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test and we have the Shapiro-Wilk test. Now for these analyses, significance is not ideal. You want a p-value greater than 0.05 for these tests, ideally. So what they're doing is it's comparing your data for job satisfaction to a perfect bell-shaped curve. And if we have a significant result, meaning a p-value below 0.05, then we have a difference between a bell-shaped curve and our data, which is not ideal. So we want non-significance for these tests, meaning a p-value greater than 0.05. And that's what we have. So you'll want to discuss with your committee if they have a preference, kind of see both tests used. I would not present both, I would just present one. So the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, both the p-values are 0.2, which is greater than 0.05. And then the Shapiro-Wilk 0.16 and 0.067 are both larger than 0.05. So the assumption of normality was supported. Therefore, we can stick with this column here, parametric tests. If normality had been violated, then I would shift to the second column. Okay, so let's run an independent t-test between job satisfaction and gender. To do this, we'll go to Analyze and Compare Means, and then Independent Sample t-test. And we'll put job satisfaction in this top box, test variables, and we'll put gender in the bottom box. Then we need to define the groups. It just means we need to identify 1 and 2 in here. So it should by default be set to the right numbers, 1 and 2. And then click OK. Okay, so this is what we see for the t-test output. And at the top, you can see the mean scores. Okay, we can see the job satisfaction mean scores for males and females, and we can see the sample size as well. So another thing to keep in mind is that the sample sizes need to be in the same ballpark. You don't want to have a sample of 100 cases versus 5 cases. Try to keep them fairly similar if that's possible. And then what you want to look for next is the two-sided p-value right here. And this is telling us if we have a significant difference in job satisfaction between males and females. If the p-value is below 0.05, then we have significance. If it's greater, we do not. So in this case, 0.904 and 0.765 are greater than 0.05. You don't have evidence of a significant difference in job satisfaction based on gender. And we can see that in the mean scores up here, they're very similar, 3.83 for males, 3.81 for females at pre-test, and at post-test, it's also very similar. Okay, so that is an independent sample t-test, and if the assumptions are not supported, then you can run a Mann-Whitney u-test. For a paired sample t-test, also called a dependent sample t-test, this is looking at differences in matched variables over time. So that's kind of just a fancy way of saying pre-test and post-test. Assuming you have a pre-test, then potentially an intervention, and then a post-test. Okay, the requirement for this is that you have one matched dependent variable that is measured 2 times. It can't be 1 time, it can't be 3 times, it's specifically 2 times. Let me go back to the previous slide here. So I should have mentioned, if you're doing a comparison for 3 groups, say ethnicity, African American, white, Asian, Hispanic, something like that, then you need to do an ANOVA. You can't do an independent sample t-test. You have to run an ANOVA if you have 3 or more groups. Same thing applies here when you're doing a pre and post. If you were doing a pre, post, and maybe a follow-up at some time in the future, 3 time points, then you can run a repeated measures ANOVA in that case. But if you just have pre and post, then just do a paired sample t-test. Very much like an independent sample t-test, there are assumptions you should verify, but there are fewer. It's fewer than an independent t-test. Similar ones as before, and again, normality is the primary assumption here, which we have already verified. We verified that normality was supported for job satisfaction, so we can proceed with that test. And this would be testing just a difference between your pre and post. Is there a difference in job satisfaction before and after the intervention? Keeping in mind the data has to be organized like this. You need to have a participant across this one row for this one individual. We have their pre-test and their post. So you have to have a way of matching your participants at pre and post. If that's an ID number or an email address, you have to match your. Okay, to do the paired sample t-test, we will go to Analyze, and then Compare Means, and then Paired Sample t-test. And that brings up this box here. Then we just put in our pre and post into this right box and click OK. All right, so this is going to test for a change in job satisfaction over time. We can see the mean scores at the top here. At pre, it was 3.82, and that increased to 4.02. Was that a significant change? Have to look at this table right here, and we can see the two-sided p-value is significant. It is below 0.05. In fact, it's below 0.001. So highly significant. We do have a significant increase in job satisfaction. All right, and then there's only one more type of t-test, which is a one-sample t-test. This is a little more rare, but I still do see it run occasionally. So this is comparing data that you've gathered to a previous. So if you want to test if there's a difference between your data and an average that someone else has computed previously. So something like that, the job satisfaction survey here used a Likert scale from 1 to 5. So it was strongly disagree, disagree, neutral was a 3, agree is a 4, and strongly agree is a 5. So something you could do with this, if you go to compare means and then one sample t-test, you can put job satisfaction over here, and then the test value is what you're comparing your data to. So this could be prior literature. It could be a number that you have in mind. The default option will be 0. And something in a case like this, I would use the neutral response. So a 3. 3 was right in the middle of the Likert scale. So if we click OK here, what this is going to assess is, are the scores that we obtained significantly different than a neutral response, which was a 3. And again, it gives you a two-sided p-value right here, and they're both significant. So what it's saying is that this 3.82 at pretest is significantly higher than a neutral response. And likewise with the post-test, 4.02 is significantly larger than a 3, a neutral response. All right, and that pretty much covers it for t-tests. So the first thing to do is you need to identify your research questions. Do you have independent grouping variables like treatment control or gender or ethnicity? Are you comparing for differences over time, or are you strictly looking for differences by group? Then you can use a software like Intellectus Statistics, which is our company software, SPSS or Stata. And you can use those softwares to analyze your data and present interpretations. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. Okay, I do see we had a question from Linda. Let me move this to a Word document here so everyone can read it. So the example was not less than or equal to 0.05, so not normal. Should it be parametric, but non-parametric? If that's in regards to normality, that was up here. So here we were looking at normality, and we used the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test and the Shapiro-Wilk. The hope for these tests, what is ideal is that the p-values are greater than 0.05 for these tests. Kind of a rare time in statistics where you hope for non-significance. So these values, the p-values, need to be greater than 0.05, and if they are, then normality is supported. And then you can run parametric analyses. Okay, we have a question from Teresa. So I'm comparing two braces with the same subjects. Each person will wear one brace and walk in the gait lab, then brace two and walk in the gait lab. Is that still a dependent sample t-test? And are these always non-parametrics and the samples are not independent groups? Okay, so let's look at the first question here. As soon as I see the same subjects, then yes, that does sound like it's matched pairs. So you'll have, it would be data organized very much like this, where you'll have, I don't know exactly what measurements you're recording, but yeah, you're going to have across one row, you're going to have the data for one brace and then the second brace. So you would do a paired sample or a dependent sample test in that case. And for the second question, are these always non-parametric since the samples are not independent groups? A paired t-test is parametric. So a paired t-test or a dependent sample t-test are still considered parametric. The independent groups, that matters for an independent sample t-test. So if you had one group receiving one brace and then a completely separate group receiving a second brace, then that would be an independent test. And that is where independent groups would matter. You don't need independent groups for your example here. Does that make sense? All right, awesome. We have a question from Sherry. I have some data about one group of students' survey results using a 7-point Likert scale. I'm interested in a one sample test. Okay, so to run a one sample t-test, you have to pick what value you're going to compare your data to. So that could be done through the literature. It's usually done in the literature. If this survey has been used in the past, there might be some benchmarks that you can compare your data to. That's usually the value that you use for a one sample t-test. So remember, for the example we did, I picked 3 here because 3 was a neutral response. You could do the same thing. You know, you could, because yours is a 7-point Likert scale, you could potentially pick 4 as the neutral response and see if your scores are different than the neutral. Or you can look for prior literature and see if your study data is significantly different than previous studies. Okay, we have a question from Cecilia. I have a question with the new software called JASP. Do you have an idea? I've heard of it. It's not something that our company works with. So I'm not too familiar with JASP. Probably something we need to take a look at, start learning at our company. All right, do we have any other questions? And just as a follow-up, Cecilia, the primary software we use at our company is SPSS, but we also use Stata, and we use our own software at our company. It's called Intellectus as well. SPSS, Stata, and Intellectus are the three go-tos. All right, we have a question from Maddie. What t-test to compare two groups if N1 and N2 have different sample sizes? I would still do an independent t-test. It doesn't have to be equal. It just has to be relatively in the same ballpark. But if there's a large difference between N1 and N2, you probably have to interpret with caution. I don't typically run a different test. I'm not familiar if there is one, but I would just run a t-test, an independent t-test, and if the sample sizes vary quite a bit, just interpret with caution. All right, a question from Jerry. Does the t-test, let me move it over here. Is the t-test applicable to a population of less than 30? It still is. It's not ideal. You can run power analyses to figure out what is the ideal sample size. So this is G power right here. And if you go to independent mean test here for two groups and change power to 0.8, which is conventional today, the ideal target is 128 participants, which would be 64 in each group. Now that's in a perfect statistics world. Obviously, it's not going to work out that perfectly. You can still run it. You can still run it with less than 30 cases. You just have to be cautious in the interpretation. It reduces the power of finding. All right, some good questions. Do we have any additional questions? I did see some registrants opened the webinar a little bit late. Just in case you missed that part, we're going to send everyone a copy of the recording and the PowerPoint. Okay, we have a couple additional questions here. Does the assumption of independence of observations need to be met for a Mann-Whitney test? Yes. You don't want to have overlap across your groups, even for a Mann-Whitney U-test. They have to be independent groups. So that is one assumption that kind of carries over between a t-test and a Mann-Whitney test. Okay, we have a question. What t-test for a proportion? There are, I'm not sure about a t-test for proportions, but there are z-tests for proportions. That might be something to check. So you can do a test potentially, but it's comparing two proportions to each other. So those are percentages or rates, and it's assessing for differences between one proportion and the second. Okay, we have a question from a couple questions from Aziz. First, is it possible to run t-tests between a number of factors? Why do I need to run a t-test and when? So it comes down to having a two-group comparison or looking at changes over time between pre-test and post-test. So coming back over here, an independent t-test is only used if you're comparing two groups. Treatment control, a paired t-test is only used comparing 2 points in time, pre-test and post-test, or two different conditions. And then a one sample t-test is comparing your data to a specified value. It's a very specific use case for each one of these. And then is it possible to run a t-test between a number of factors? The deciding point for that is if the factors only have two groups. If you only have two groups to compare, then you can do t-tests. But if you have three or more groups, then you probably need to run ANOVAs, an analysis of variance. All right, a question from Sherry. All right, for the one group of student surveys, about 8 independent survey questions. Is a one sample t-test appropriate? Yeah, I think so. But if you don't have a second group and if you don't have a pre-test and a post-test, then I think a one sample t-test is your best option. You just have to figure out what is the value that you're comparing each of the survey questions to. That's the neutral response, or if it's a previous study that's established an average, you can compare your data to that average. Okay, so it's a new study, then most likely just compare it to the neutral, which would be a 4. Yep, no problem. Okay, so what is the difference between a z-test and a t-test? Z-tests usually involve looking at population parameters. So if you have population statistics, that's when you run a z-test, whereas a t-test is more specific to samples. Those samples derived from the population. T-tests are looking at smaller samples than z-tests. I don't see z-tests run too often, except for this one, a 2 proportion test. Yep. Okay, we have a question from Aziz. From your experience, are Likert scales parametric or non-parametric? That's been a debate for decades. I tend to lean on the non-parametric side. So if you're looking at an individual Likert scale item, strongly agree to strongly disagree, that I think that's more ordinal because you can't have decimals as possibilities. So I tend to lean towards the idea that Likert scales are non-parametric, or they're ordinal, which would lead you to run non-parametric analyses. Now, with this example here, job satisfaction was computed from Likert scale questions. There were 10 questions that were averaged together to generate these scores. Once you add or take an average of Likert scale questions, that new variable is continuous. You can run parametric analyses in that case. So if you have if you have continuous data, if you have decimals, then you should run parametrics. If everything is strictly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, only Likert scale data, then you should run non-parametrics. That's my opinion. But you can find literature to support the other side of it as well. All right, question from Cecilia. What is the difference between an f-test and a t-test? So f-tests you will see run for ANOVAs and regressions. So an f-test is using, it's when you have 3 or more groups typically. Okay, so if you're running an ANOVA, is there a difference in job satisfaction based on ethnicity and you have multiple ethnicities? That's when you use an F test. A T test is only used to compare two groups or 2 points in time. Right? ANOVAs and regressions, T test, group comparisons. And from Maddie, necessary to standardize every time I get my data to obtain a good result. I don't standardize very often. I only standardize if I'm looking for outliers and create z-scores to look for outliers. I don't typically standardize otherwise. You want to use the raw data if possible. But there are instances, if you're looking at test scores or different biological measurements, sometimes you do need to standardize, kind of specific to your topic. Question from Jerry. What method is appropriate for a two-tailed test? So you'll see when we did the independent sample t-test here, there are two columns. There's a one-sided p-value and there's a two-sided p-value. So it comes down to your hypothesis. If in your hypotheses you anticipate an increase or a strict decrease, then you do a one-sided test. If you're just anticipating a difference in general, you don't know which direction it's going to go, then you do a two-tailed. SPSS provides both the one-tailed and two-tailed findings. Okay, so to kind of break that down, that's a good question. So if you hypothesize a specific direction and one-tailed test, no hypothesized direction, and the same thing applies for the paired sample t-test. This was the pre and post right here. So you can see one-sided and two-sided p-values. And that comes down to your hypothesis. You anticipated an increase or decrease specifically, which most of the time I don't see that, but sometimes. And then if there's no hypothesized direction, you just think there's going to be a difference, then do a two-tailed test. All right, do we have any additional questions? Absolutely. Thanks for joining, Aziz. All right, we will send everyone a copy of the webinar as well as the PowerPoint. Give us a call if you have any questions about the services we offer, and let us know if we can be of any assistance. Have a great day. Take care.